Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 298. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have news on the war in Ukraine, the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, a U.S. Palestinian journalist who was killed by Israeli snipers. We have some announcements on the U.S. looking into that, and then some news about Syria as well. So share today's show. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute where the show is hosted, and I'm the news editor. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee, anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. On Twitter, you can follow me at KyleAnzalone_. You can donate directly to the show at Patreon, Subscribestar, or if you want to donate us some crypto, you could do that with the links or the information for Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash in the show notes page. And you can support the show by supporting our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Tons of high quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. My personal favorite is the sports cream. It has a nice, refreshing menthol smell. It works almost instantly. I would say like 10-15 minutes. You could start to feel your muscles relax wherever you've applied it. It lasts a long time, and it's just consistently effective at relieving muscle pain. So you have some muscle pain, check out the sports cream from Paloma Verde. And when you check out, you use the promo code PEACE, PEACE. You spend $75 or more, you get 20% off, and the show gets a kickback. So it's a great way to get your CBD at a good price and to help out your favorite podcast. All right, now let's get into the show. First article today, I wrote for antiwar.com on July 3rd. Titled Belarus intercepts missiles fired by Ukraine targeting its military facilities. President Alexander Lukashenko said Ukraine attacked Belarus, but its air defenses foiled Kiev's military strike. He did not provide evidence for his assertion and indicated Belarus would not have a military response. Speaking at an Independence Day event on Saturday, Lukashenko said, "They are provoking us. I have to tell you, 3 days ago, maybe a bit more, an attempt to strike military facilities on Belarusian territory was made from the territory of Ukraine. But thank God the Panzer anti-aircraft systems managed to intercept all the missiles that the armed forces of Ukraine launched." Now, there's a couple interesting things here. As I know in the article, he doesn't present any evidence, no, shot down Ukrainian missiles or anything like that. Now, it's possible that, when a missile is fired, these radar systems, I think, are pretty quick and adept at telling, where they're supposed to end up. And so maybe they were intercepted over Ukrainian territory. And for that reason, Lukashenko is unable to provide any physical evidence here. But it's also possible, I guess, that it didn't go as he said. Either the missiles missed their targets or they actually did hit their targets and he's lying for that reason, or he's just making up the whole story. But I didn't see any direct denials from Kiev, which is, interesting when it comes to this kind of thing, that you're not getting a direct denial. And then also, if you look at how Belarus has been involved in this war, it's not quite as Lukashenko explains, which may help to explain why Kiev would have carried out this attack. He said, noted that, and it seems like Minsk hopes to avoid entering into a conflict with Ukraine, saying, "We hold on. We understand that these are provocations and we keep holding on. A bad peace is better than a good war." However, Belarus allowed its territory to be used by Russia to invade Ukraine. Throughout the war, Kiev has claimed that Moscow used Minsk's airspace to target several sites in Ukraine. The U.S. and its allies have sanctioned Belarus in its economic war against Russia. And so, Belarus, I think, maybe not to quite the extent of the US, but I think to a fairly large extent is involved in this conflict on the Russian side. And so it's not as if, Belarus could claim that they're innocent victims in all of this. And the strikes could be retaliation for allowing their territory to be used. Also, it's a very close state. And so if they are targeting Belarusian military facilities, they could be either hitting Russian military equipment or potentially military equipment that could be used by Russia. And so, Ukraine could make a military case for all of these strikes. Now, we also had Russia saying that Ukraine targeted its territory as well. This is the Belgorod area that's been targeted several times. And it's important to note that this territory is less than 50 miles from the Russia-Ukraine border because the US and UK have given Ukraine rocket launchers with a range of 50 miles. And so anything that hits within 50 miles of the Russia-Ukraine border, you have to put a question mark if potentially these are Western weapons, US-made weapons, being used to carry out attacks inside of Russia. And if that's the case, it could cause a very serious escalation in this war. Now, look, from the Ukrainian perspective, this is very understandable to want to and carry out attacks inside of Russia. From the Western perspective, though, it can't be considered worth escalation with Moscow to allow these kind of attacks to happen. And, really, it shouldn't be worth it to transfer these weapons to Ukraine in the first place. Now, another very interesting story that we have is from the New York Times. And the New York Times reports that U.S. vets are close to the front lines in Ukraine, providing training and also helping to plan operations for the Ukrainian forces. Now, this isn't a very long or detailed piece in the Times. And so, that was interesting. However, you do have to wonder if the U.S. is maybe coordinating with these veterans at all, and to what extent, maybe they're not quite U.S. Special Operations Forces in uniform anymore, but are they essentially acting as U.S. paid mercenaries? Should be a big question. The New York Times briefly noted that their funding either came from, their own bank accounts or from online donations, if let's say somebody crowdfunds $100,000, well, could the CIA, be kind of funneling money that way? That's a real possibility. And again, even if they do pay their own way, if they are there, and let's say they're calling up people they know at the Pentagon and asking what kind of training do you think that these Ukrainian forces need, or maybe they're calling up sources at the Pentagon and getting intelligence, the lines are going to get very blurry between who's a U.S. state actor fighting on behalf of the U.S. government for Ukraine against Russia versus who is just, some civilian who has taken up arms in Ukraine and is generally trying to help the fight. All right. Next article is by Dave DeCamp, titled Putin Declares Victory in Ukraine's Eastern Luhansk Region. On Monday, President Vladimir Putin declared victory in the Luhansk Oblast in eastern Ukraine, a day after Ukrainian forces withdrew from a key city, the last area they held in the region. The Russian defense minister told Putin in a televised meeting that operation in Luhansk was completed. Putin congratulated the military on liberating the oblast and ordered his troops to participate in the fighting to rest and increase their combat capabilities. Now, I saw a couple articles that had interpreted this statement from Putin as saying that Russia was like going into a complete that they were just focused on controlling the area they have and ceasing offensive operations. I'm not quite sure that was the case. I think it may have been a little bit more slogan and PR than that. And Putin may have just been saying that for the troops that have been doing the fighting. Like, your guy, now you guys can rest. And, maybe they will be carrying out less offensive operations in the northern half of the Donbass in the next couple of weeks or something like that. But I don't think this is really a sign that Russia is scaling down its military offensive in the east. And as Dave says, Russia is now focusing its offensive in eastern Ukraine on areas in the Donetsk Oblast. And so, again, I just bring this up because I saw headlines from Newsweek and one other source today that suggested, again, Russia was going into some kind of less offensive type operations, and I don't think that's the case at all. All right, next I want to talk about a statement from John Kirby, who, we've talked about a lot in the past year on the show. He was the spokesperson for the Pentagon, and he has moved over to the White House. He's now at the National Security Council, coordinating for strategic communications. And on Sunday, he said the U.S. will not push Ukraine to reach a negotiated settlement with Ukraine, even if the Biden administration thinks it's the right thing to do. Kirby, who recently joined the NSC after serving as a Pentagon spokesperson, said that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine in its war and that it's up to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky when to pursue negotiations with Moscow. Zelensky gets to determine how victory is decided and when and on what terms. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue to make sure that he can succeed on the battlefield so that he can succeed at the table. But even President Zelensky will tell you that time is not now for those discussions. Kirby's comments came after CNN reported that White House officials privately doubt that Ukraine can retake all the territory Russia has captured since it invaded on February 24th. And the really interesting thing is, I had talked about this on the show in the past, is the Washington Post that reports that all the U.S. support that we've given Ukraine has encouraged Zelensky to be more ambitious. And so now, rather than just wanting to go back to the pre-invasion borders, the pre-February borders, he's seeking to go back to the Ukrainian 2013 borders and retake Crimea and the entire Donbass, which is a far more ambitious policy, especially when you look at Crimea, which has been firmly held. Russia annexed this territory 8 years ago. This is firmly held piece of Russia. And so to think that you're going to take that back when you're losing territory is quite ambitious. And so, this statement coming from Kirby essentially saying that the U.S. it continues to give a blank check to Zelensky and say that you have our undying military support to continue to fight a war they know Ukraine can't win is, I really think, very much darker than even the idea that we're just trying to help Kiev do what Kiev wants to do. I really do think that this is about giving Ukraine and Kiev a false sense of confidence, because they know that even if Ukraine cannot win this war, the longer Ukraine fights, the more Russia fights, and that means the more forces that Russia loses, the more that this war costs Russia. And ultimately, Russia being in a weaker geostrategic position is, I think, what Western leaders view as the ultimate goal of this war. It is in no way about restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity or sovereignty or anything like that. Now, I guess, admittedly, I would have to say that, from their point of view, it would be a major Russian loss if Russia would have to go back to those very early not very early, but the 2013 borders or something like that. And so they could say, well, yeah, we really do want that. But again, the goal is not about Ukraine. The goal is about bleeding Russia. All right. Want to mention a couple other important stories here. We have a Russian politician calling to create a Cuban Missile Crisis-like situation by putting hypersonic missiles somewhere where they're within 5 minutes of being able to hit U.S. targets. And look, obviously this is a really needless and stupid provocation, and should be denounced. Playing around, making threats with nuclear weapons is absolutely dangerous and unnecessary. However, I think if he's just trying to make the point that, look, for the Americans, you really need to be able to put the shoe on the other foot and see what this is like for Russia. And this being that intolerable for you is the situation that Russia is in, and is intolerable for us. Turkey has seized a ship carrying grain in the Black Sea that was alleged to have been carrying grain that was grown in Ukrainian territory that was then seized by Russia, and then I guess Russia was going to sell this grain. Now, these are all accusations at this point. Russia hasn't denied it, which I find to be interesting, but we will see how this policy plays out. I could very much see a situation where, like with Iranian oil, occasionally the U.S. will claim that, this oil violates sanctions when it actually doesn't, or the U.S. has just pirated oil that, Iran was taken to Venezuela. All right, major news here. Dave DeCamp on July 4th at antiwar.com. Ukraine says it needs $750 billion for a recovery plan. And oh yes, this news does get worse. A 2-day conference on Ukraine's future reconstruction efforts kicked off in Switzerland on Monday, and Ukrainian officials put the price tag on their recovery plan at $750 billion. Addressing the conference virtually, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the reconstruction of Ukraine is a common task for the entire democratic world, all countries who can say they are civilized. Ukrainian Prime Minister said the funding would need to come from grants and through loans from partner nations, independent organizations, corporations, and Ukraine's own budget. But he said Ukraine believes the key source of recovery should be confiscated assets of Russia and Russian oligarchs. And so they are talking about confiscating, hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian wealth. This is the kind of move that will damage U.S.-Russian relations for decades to come, and I think it is very dangerous. I'm not sure that Russia would ever go to war, say, because they had $500 million stolen from them, but it would maybe create the political climate where détente is really impossible, and eventually then something else could spark or lead to wider conflict. Now, if that money doesn't come from Russia and comes from the West, of course this is going to be incredibly difficult for Western countries that are already struggling to pay for the sanctions aspect of this war. This is, one of the fallouts from the war that isn't getting enough attention. It is that it has increased ties between Russia and China, but I think we're starting to see a case where China is benefiting some and Russia is starting to give a little bit more support to Chinese foreign policy goals that Moscow is maybe doesn't see an advantage to from Moscow's perspective. So we have Japan spots Chinese-Russian warships near disputed Senkaku Islands. The Japanese government lodged a protest with Beijing on Monday after it spotted Chinese and Russian warships near the disputed Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Japan's defense ministry said the Chinese frigate was spotted just outside the Senkaku Islands territorial waters, which extends 12 nautical miles from the coast. A Russian warship was seen in the same area 40 minutes earlier. According to a Japanese news source, the Chinese frigate chased the Russian warship out of the area in an attempt to demonstrate that Beijing's sovereignty over the Japanese-controlled Senkaku Islands, or Daiasus, as they are known in China. A Japanese Defense Ministry official said it appeared the Russian warship was in the area to avoid a typhoon. Responding to Japan's protest, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lejin insisted that the Senkakus were Chinese territory. When asked if the Russia and China coordinated the incident, Zhao said, "If you're interested in Russia's actions, maybe you should take this question to the Russian side." And so I don't know. My suspicion is that this probably was coordinated based on the increased naval coordination between Russia and China in this area. And, then China being able to say, oh, this is Chinese territory. Some other news on Russia and China ties. The U.S. Tells China to stop spreading Russian lies, and this was, I think, the U.S. ambassador to China that made that statement. The U.S. sanctioned 5 Chinese companies it claims were supporting Russia's war effort. And then we have the Madrid strategic concept document. This was the NATO conference in Madrid. Talked about it a lot earlier in this week and last week. While most of the attention was on Russia, China and North Korea were also, a part of the worldwide Western group of leaders coming together and forming military ties to take on states that they label threats. And so the document labeled China a systematic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security, and this was seen as a very big deal in Beijing. North Korea, by the way, is still very upset that the U.S. met with Seoul and Tokyo on the sidelines of the Madrid summit and talked about increasing military ties between those 3 states, and issued a further threat saying that they would have to bolster their defense ties in response. Back to China news for one last story. Blinken is supposed to speak with the Chinese foreign minister at the upcoming G20 summit in Bali this week. I believe Putin's going to be there as well, so I'm sure that summit will draw a lot of headlines, and we may talk about some very important news coming out of that summit. All right, next up, news on Israel. First year date to camp June 29th. Unilever sells Ben & Jerry's in Israel ice cream to be sold in settlements. Unilever, the parent company of Ben & Jerry's, has sold the ice cream company's business interest in Israel to an Israeli company, caving to pressure over a planned sale in illegal Israeli settlement. So very important here. Ben & Jerry's no longer own Ben & Jerry. They sold the company to Unilever. There is still the Ben & Jerry's board that made the decision not to sell the ice cream in Israeli settlements, which was a bold and important move. Limited as it was bold and important, and it was a great decision by the Ben & Jerry's board that was supported by at least one of the I think Ben Cohen had come out and supported it. And I'll just note here that, as always on Dave's articles at antiwar.com about Ben & Jerry's, let's see, it says, disclosure, antiwar.com in the past has received donations from Ben & Jerry's co-founder Ben Cohen, and of course I do work for antiwar.com myself, although I don't really factor that into any of my analysis on any of this. So anyways, that's what's going on with the situation with the ice cream sales in Israel. This, I guess, was presented as a victory by Israel, that they were able to continue to have these sales go on in the West Bank settlements, although it will be rebranded. It won't say like Ben & Jerry's. I guess it'll say whatever the kind of the rebranded Hebrew name is. All right, another story on Israel here that is very important, and this kind of, I believe, ended up as I predicted. So, 6 weeks or so after Israeli snipers shot and killed Al Jazeera, very prominent, decades long journalist in Israel, Shireen Abu Akleh, she was shot in the face by an Israeli sniper and killed. Then Israeli forces harassed this woman's funeral. Well, anyways, the U.S., the Palestinians then turned the bullet that killed her over to the U.S. And my understanding and the Palestinians' understanding is that they had transferred that bullet to the U.S. with the understanding that it would not be touched by the Israelis. But then the Israelis said that they were going to run ballistics on the bullet, and I'm pretty sure that ended up happening. The U.S. determined that the bullet was too damaged to have any, to be able to determine what gun it came from, although it was Israeli snipers that likely killed Abu Akleh, and as I predicted, they have a very strong qualifying language. They don't have any reason to believe it was on purpose. So if you could imagine this, you have a American Ukrainian journalist reporting in a Russian-occupied Ukrainian city, and as they are arriving to report on a Russian military operation, one of that journalist is shot in the face by a Russian sniper, and then everybody's going, well, they might not have meant to shoot the journalist in the face. I think after 6 weeks, that excuse would be pretty tired, and nobody would really feel that was the case. They also shot another journalist here too. They opened fire and shot and killed Shireen, but they also killed Ali, who was, I believe, a producer or worked with Shireen in some capacity. So very disappointing. We're seeing that from the U.S., of course. It's not in any way going to impact the trip that Joe Biden is taking to Israel next week. All right. Let's talk about Israeli attacks on Syria. This from Jason Ditz on June 3rd. For the first time in over a week, Israel attacked Syrian territory. This time it was an airstrike against a poultry farm along the coast. 2 civilians were wounded in the attack. It's not clear if the poultry farm was operational at the time of the pre-dawn attack. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights suggested it was a former farm used by Hezbollah, which would explain why Israel's interest in the attack, although sometimes the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights isn't perfect on its reporting. But this provoked a very interesting reaction from Russia. Israel, for the past, I don't know how many years, 8 years now, has been carrying out airstrikes in Syria with pretty little response from Moscow whatsoever. And Assad is a key ally of Putin, and so these attacks have hampered the military effort to try to defeat the opposition to Bashar al-Assad, which is mainly made up of jihadists. So over the weekend, Israeli carried out an attack against poultry farms on the Syrian coast, wounding 2 civilians. Russia issued a statement on Monday suggesting such attacks are categorically unacceptable. Now, Russia could say this. It will be a difference if Russia actually starts to take action. Now, the war in Ukraine, I think some of the fallout has been the Moscow-Tel Aviv relationship is no longer as close as it was forever. Israel, I think, tried very hard, and Russia tried very hard to keep that door open. And the pressure put on by the West on Tel Aviv to side more with Kiev in that war, and in part Russia's response to that has really damaged the relationship between Israel and Russia. So I think that in part explains why we're getting this response. A couple other stories dealing with Israel. The Financial Times reports that a few dozen French nationals are going back to France after spending years in Syrian prisons or refugee camps. It didn't specifically say that these prisoners were at Al-Hol, but I believe that they were. This is in U.S.-occupied Syria. It's ran by the Kurdish YPG. Tens of thousands of people are here, and a lot of them are refugees, and I guess invested in the more refugee camp than prison camp part of the whole Al-Hol facility. However, there are thousands of people who are not allowed to leave. They are the former sons, daughters, or spouses of Islamic State fighters, and many of these kids have grown up in these camps, and it's a horrible situation. Just to talk about how horrific the camp is, this was actually reported by Voice of America. There's been over 100 murders in Al-Hol over the past 18 months. Moving on to Iraq, where Turkey continues to carry out military operations. This from Margaret Griffiths at antiwar.com with her Iraq Daily Roundup. Turkish operations against the Kurdistan Workers' Party targets left 6 guerrillas dead. A Kurdish soldier was also killed. And so these are the kind of numbers we see pretty frequently coming out of northern Iraq with the Turkish military operations targeting Kurds. U.S. Taliban hold talks in Doha on frozen Afghan funds. U.S. and Taliban officials held talks in Doha on Thursday to discuss the billions in Afghanistan central bank reserves that the U.S. has frozen since the Taliban took over the country in August 2021. The meeting was the first time since March that the U.S. and Taliban officials met face-to-face, and comes as Afghanistan is recovering from an earthquake that killed at least 1,000 people. And so good that these talks are happening, but the U.S. and the Biden administration really need to start making some progress on freeing up some of this money to go back to the Taliban. I know the money is going to the Taliban, that's bad, but the money is the Afghan government's money, and the Taliban are now the government of Afghanistan. If the U.S. didn't, build a Afghan government, then Afghanistan now wouldn't be in a position where hundreds of people are starving to death because of the withdrawal of the U.S. aid and the currency reserves of Afghanistan, which, may have largely come from the United States, but, are now owned by the Afghan government, and that is the Taliban. All right, rounding up here with some news on Yemen. Of course, anytime we talk about Yemen, the most important thing going on is the War Powers Resolution going through Congress, and the Libertarian Party, hell yeah, Libertarian Party doing good things, is leading a campaign. Well, I don't know about leading. It's probably not fair to some of these organizations that have been working on for years. But, on social media, if you go on Twitter, the LP is really pushing, really making a lot of noise, really getting a lot of excellent feedback on pushing people to call 1-833-STOP-WAR, to call your representative and to demand that they co-sponsor this Yemen War Powers bill in order to put an end to the U.S. involvement in the worst thing happening in the planet. And so that's awesome. That's going on. Also, good news coming from Yemen. Talks are happening. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of progress going on. These talks are pretty limited in scope, but, will make the difference for tens of thousands of Yemeni people if they can produce some kind of results. This from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Talks resume on Yemen's Taiz. Area braces for new attacks. On Sunday, negotiations resumed in Yemen's third city at Taiz, which with the goal of a ceasefire that would open main roads out of the city, finally allowing people to flee. This city, when I think the Houthi may have actually took control of this city briefly during their initial offensive in 2014 and 2015, but I'm not sure of that. I do know that since the Saudis started backing the Yemeni and the former, Yemeni Salaf forces and pouring their own Sudanese mercenaries into Yemen to fight, that the battle lines have largely been that the Saudi bad side does control the city of Taiz, but that Houthi forces control most, or if not all, the real routes out of that city. And so it's not like the city has been fully besieged or anything like that for the past 8 years, but it has been very much cut off to large parts of Yemen, and it's a very dangerous place to live. You hear lots of stories here of people dying either from sniper fire, landmines, or rocket fire, right? So any kind of restriction that could free up people to leave this area would be absolutely great. It's unclear if that's going to happen, and there's also some concern that if these talks, I guess, break down, that the way to resolve this will once again be an uptick in fighting. But so far, I believe the now about 3 month long ceasefire in Yemen is continuing to hold. Now, Biden will be in Saudi Arabia, I believe, next week. I know he's in Israel next week, and I think he's in Saudi Arabia the day after. So it should be next week that Biden's going to be in Saudi Arabia. And maybe this will actually be a chance to ramp up pressure on the president on the Yemen war. He's really trying to downplay the oil aspect of his visit to Saudi Arabia, but you have to imagine that a big part of it has to be the oil. And if Biden is looking for Saudi to increase oil production, you wonder what he's willing to trade away. And if it's the progress that's been made in Yemen, I really wouldn't be surprised in him giving more military support, possibly in the form of security guarantees to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The reason those security guarantees would be so important, by the way, is the Houthis can't do a whole lot against Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They have American bought and paid for military's very advanced equipment. However, they do have some unsophisticated missiles that they can upgrade and that they can fire into Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Those missiles can bypass those countries' missile defense, air defense systems, and can hit key targets. And so that risk prevents I think at this point, Saudi Arabia and the UAE from escalating this war. But if they could lower the possibility of that happening, then they could, I think, escalate the war. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up for today. Thank you so much. Remember, subscribe to the show. Episode 300 coming up soon. I just confirmed plans today. It's going to be absolutely great. I'm really looking forward to it. And then show with Kyle Freeman later in the week. Thanks, everyone.